Noon, I'm Stephen Critis. Glad you're able to join us on Newsbeat. So the dominant political issue of the moment is still the US currency, the foreign exchange that was stolen from the farm of President Cyril Ramaphosa. He's refused to answer direct questions about it, but it seems at this stage that he has questions, legal questions to answer. This crisis may reveal some of the problems within our politics and our society. One of the people looking at this is Professor Raymond Suttner. He was jailed for his role in the fight against apartheid. He's now suggested that one of the problems our state has is that President Ramaphosa actually has not made a big enough change in our state since Jacob Zuma was president. In other words, the state hasn't changed enough since that time. Professor Suttner joins us now. Professor, good evening to you, afternoon to you rather. It's an important piece you've written. There's a lot to it, but maybe let's start with the point you make, that Ramaphosa has not made enough changes. What do you mean by that when you compare it to the Zuma era?
Thank you very much for having me on the show, and good afternoon to your listeners. I initially started to write about the scandal around this farm, but I started to realize that what we are dealing with is a more serious phenomenon, whereby the Zuma era had one of the best constitutions in the world and a legal system modeled on it, but it was displaced by lawlessness on the part of the president and a number of other ministers and acolytes of his, so that the hierarchy which ought to have the law and the constitution at the top was in fact displaced by a hierarchy where the lawlessness took precedence. Now, what I'm arguing in this article is that there's been more continuity than rupture in the post-Zuma era. Wrong is still right in the law of South Africa today as far as the leaders are concerned. I'm not speaking about President Ramaphosa, I'm speaking about countless numbers who've been fingered by Zondo and a number of other allegations and impending trials and so forth. So I'm arguing then that we've got a very serious situation if the law of the land is not taking precedence over the lawlessness of the land. Now, am I exaggerating things? It doesn't seem to be the case. If what's alleged, if 10% of what is alleged against President Ramaphosa is true, it's a very serious confirmation of what I'm saying. But it's not only President Ramaphosa, it's many others who have done things which seem to indicate that they believe they have the space to act in contradiction with the law and the Constitution. And I think this threatens the future of democracy, well, it's already under threat, but the possibility of recovering from democracy unless we can find a way of remedying that.
You suggest, and this sort of maybe builds on what you're saying, you suggest that we have the judiciary and Chapter 9 institutions which do their jobs relatively well. But in fact, senior people in the ANC and the EFF, you say on a local level, the Democratic Alliance, don't actually respect those bodies. They don't respect the law. I mean, that's really what it boils down to, isn't it?
Yes. Well, you see, the courts have to make decisions. The Chapter 9 institutions, the ones that function well, make findings that in some cases are supposed to be binding. And if politicians do not respect these, and there are many cases where, let's take, for example, public toilets and a number of other facilities in schools, there have been court orders after court orders and they've not been implemented. Now, that is a case of the people who are supposed to give the example to the rest of society showing the finger to the courts. Now, that's not the worst example one could give, But that's just one example that comes readily to mind. So what I think it signifies is that lawlessness has become a norm. You know, a norm is a set of values, standards, and those standards are supposed to be set by the Constitution, the legal system, and a number of things like that. Now, there's a counter set of norms that is in fact taking precedence when the Minister of Basic Education and local versions continue to defy those court orders.
I mean, another way of what you're saying, another example, is that a deputy mayor in KwaZulu-Natal, who comes from the Inkatha Freedom Party, has been accused of being the mastermind of a cash and transit heist. I mean, this is a deputy mayor. He's denied it, the party's denied it, but still, and it gets barely a mention. It's not national news anyway.
Yes. Well, you see, what I think is important is we've got a power crisis in this country, and it's exacerbated by sabotage. Now, there may well be political reasons why these power stations have been destroyed, or vital instruments have been destroyed. But even if it were criminality, all of this converges to create a situation where the state is facing threats that it ought not to face. There's a space being given somehow or other for people to make the state even more vulnerable than it is because of the energy crisis that we've already got being taken advantage, possibly by forces opposed to Ramaphosa, possibly by ordinary criminals. Somehow there's a convergence between state criminality and conventional criminality.
In a sense, I think there's another growing problem, which it seems to me there may be some evidence that people are ignoring politicians, so that formal politics, by which I mean parliamentary politics, and I mean specifically parliamentary politics, is becoming less important. We all saw what happened last Thursday, the sort of violence in Parliament. Not the first time. This goes back to 2015 was the first time it happened, by my memory. This means that people stop voting. Now, when people withdraw from formal politics, what happens? The idea of politics to resolve our differences, to come to common solutions, might disappear.
Well, you know, when you started to say this, I was thinking of another way of approaching this. There's a crisis in the hospitals where they can't get water, they can't get electricity. The gift of the givers step in. There is a crisis of hunger because of COVID-19 and floods and all of this. The state doesn't fulfill its duties. A number of soup kitchens, a number of informal networks step in. At a political level, you're correct. People do not feel that their vote makes much difference. And this, I think, hit the ANC particularly, where people didn't want to vote for other parties, but they stayed away. So that the percentage of eligible voters who didn't vote, some of those didn't register, some didn't turn up, does point to voting not being regarded as so significant. But, you know, I personally, although I'm arguing for forces beyond electoralism, I'm not wanting to suggest people shouldn't vote because it's a hard-won right. We need to create a situation where it again becomes a meaningful instrument for change and for democracy. But at the moment, it isn't. And you know, there are a whole lot of things that attach to that incident you're referring to, the throwing out of the EFF. The way the one woman police person or protection officer pulls the hair of an EFF woman. Now, that is not removing someone from the chamber. That is an act of assault beyond what is required to remove her from the chamber. She was already in their arms, holding her, dragging her out, and she pulled her by the hair as well. So that there's this lawlessness No one has remarked. I've seen lots of photos of it. I didn't know where to remark on it because I don't like making comments on every single thing on social media. But I mean, that's an example of something that just passes by, yet it is illegal. It's a crime to do that.
So where do we start, Professor, with improving the situation? And I mean, I've heard some people calling for early elections. I don't know if that really solves anything. It may just make our situation worse in some ways. It may increase the chaos. Your point about might becoming right, in other words, if we don't have the rule of law, well, the person who's physically or politically strongest is always going to win. Trade unions and workers will lose the most, possibly, because bosses have the money. How do we start resolving this? How do we create more respect for the rule of law and the Constitution?
Well, what I think, I'm saying not might is right, wrong is right, because wrong has become normatively stronger than right. What I'm arguing is sometimes something is urgent, but that doesn't mean that you can fix it quickly and that you can set up an instrument, an organization, say, or a system of voting that can fix it up. And what I am suggesting is that all of us who have a sense of unease about the effectiveness of the vote need to reach out to one another, not to displace the vote, but to find ways of strengthening our voices as a way of holding lawmakers, state officials, and others in place. I've suggested professionals, people from popular organizations, few as they are, business, unions, and others. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can have the UDF again. I think that would be unrealistic, and it was a different type of formation. I'm suggesting now that the crisis that we have doesn't only affect the poor. It does affect the poor, but it also affects business. Business can't do its work adequately in a climate of violence, criminality, corruption, where systems don't work. And I think we need to find a way of reaching out to one another and building unity, making compromises with one another to get a broad program of agreement, and also interacting with political parties over this, so that if parties want to be part of this, they can be part of it. But to ensure that elections are not the only show in town, they remain, but there is an influencing force beyond that, which can also be a powerful voice of the populace as a whole.
Professor Raymond Suttner, thank you for your time.